In the scorching heat of the desert, a sophisticated man in a flawless suit steps out of his luxury car, carrying a simple cardboard box. Inside, a newborn baby cries desperately as the father walks a few meters, sets the box down on the burning sand, and, without a single glance back, disappears into a cloud of dust. As the child's screams echo across the silent desert, hungry coyotes approach the box, growling softly as they size up their next meal. That's when a majestic white horse, grazing near a distant oasis, hears the cries carried by the wind and gallops across the dunes. What this courageous animal does next is truly shocking. Before we begin, if you, like us, are an animal lover, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any emotional stories. Thank you. Let's get back to our story. The scorching heat of the desert made the air shimmer like invisible waves over the golden dunes that stretched endlessly to the horizon. The oppressive silence of the arid vastness was broken by the distant roar of a powerful engine, a sound that did not belong in this ancient expanse where only the dry wind used to whisper among the parched rocks. A black luxury sedan, its gleaming paint contrasting brutally with the barren environment, came to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The vehicle looked like a dark stain against the golden and ochre palette of the desert, like an open wound on the immaculate landscape. The engine was cut, and silence reigned supreme once more. Heavier and more menacing than before, the driver's door opened with a soft click, and a sleek man stepped out wearing an impeccable suit that cost more than most people earn in a year. His Italian leather shoes gleamed under the relentless sun, and his perfectly coiffed hair didn't show a single strand out of place, even with the hot wind that blew constantly. His expression was as cold as marble, and his dark eyes showed no emotion as he surveyed the desolate landscape around him. In his arms, he held a simple, cheap cardboard box, which clashed violently with his sophisticated appearance. The box was ordinary, the kind used for shipping packages, but from it emanated a sound that would make the hardest heartache, the fragile, desperate cry of a newborn baby. The man walked a few yards through the hot sand, his steps leaving deep prints on the golden surface. Each step seemed calculated, deliberate, as if he were executing a carefully laid plan. There was no hesitation in his movements, not a tremor in his hands to indicate any trace of conscience or remorse. When he deemed he had walked far enough, he stopped. The wind blew stronger, kicking up small whirlwinds of sand that danced around his legs. The baby's cry intensified, as if the child could sense the imminent danger. A primal instinct warning of the tragedy about to unfold. With mechanical movements, the man placed the box on the scorching sand. The cardboard immediately began to absorb the intense heat, turning into a kind of outdoor oven. Inside the box, the newborn continued to cry, its screams echoing through the vast desert like a lament lost in the void. The man stood up and for a moment remained motionless, looking at the box. His face showed no emotion, no regret, no pity. It was as if he were observing a random object, something of no importance or value. His cold eyes reflected only determination and a cruel calculation that had deemed the life of an innocent child a mere obstacle to be eliminated. Without a final look back, without a word of farewell or a gesture of humanity, the man returned to his vehicle. His steps were firm and decisive, as if he had just completed a routine business task. The car door shut with a dry thud that sounded like a gunshot in the desert silence. The engine roared to life again, and the luxury car began to move, kicking up a cloud of golden dust that spread through the air like a funereal veil. The vehicle sped up, disappearing quickly into the distance, leaving only tire tracks in the sand as evidence of its passage. And then, all that remained was the deadly silence of the desert, broken only by the ever weaker cry of a helpless child, abandoned under the relentless sun in the midst of the arid vastness. The cardboard box, now a small dark speck in the golden immensity, contained the most precious and vulnerable of lives, left to the mercy of the elements and the predators that roamed the desert in search of easy prey. Fate had cast its dice, and an epic struggle for survival was just beginning. The sun continued its relentless journey across the steel blue sky, turning the desert into a gigantic furnace where every grain of sand seemed like a glowing ember. The temperature rose steadily, and the cardboard box housing the baby began to soften under the intense heat, its edges curling as if surrendering to the destructive power of the environment. Inside the makeshift box, the newborn continued to cry, but its wails were no longer as strong as before. Dehydration was beginning its cruel work, and the small voice that echoed through the desert grew weaker, more desperate. It was a sound that could break the most hardened heart, a primal plea for help that was lost in the silent expanse. The baby, despite being only a few days old, showed an extraordinary resilience that was surprising even by nature's standards. Its delicate skin was red from the heat, but it continued to squirm, fighting against the impossible circumstances with a determination that seemed to defy all odds of survival. There was something special about this child, a life force that refused to surrender easily. Far away, on a small, secluded ranch on the edge of the desert, a gray-haired Native American man woke up with a strange feeling in his chest. Joseph, as he was known in his community, had spent decades living in this arid region, and his connection to the land was so deep that he could feel when something was out of balance in the world around him. He rose slowly from his simple bed, walking to the window that overlooked the corrals where his few animals sheltered from the heat. His gaze immediately went to his white horse, Tempest, who was grazing peacefully near a small oasis he had built with his own hands over the years. The animal was magnificent, with a white mane that shone like silver under the sun, and intelligent eyes that seemed to understand much more than any ordinary horse. Joseph watched his companion with affection. Tempest was not just an animal to him. He was a partner, a friend who had shared countless adventures through the dunes and treacherous trails of the desert. Together, they knew every water source, every safe cave, every path that led to civilization through this hostile land. The tribal elder, retired after decades of serving his community and teaching the youth about ancestral traditions, had developed a wisdom that went beyond common knowledge. He knew how to interpret nature's signs, understand the messages carried by the wind, and feel when something important was happening, even miles away. That morning, something was deeply troubling him. It was a feeling he couldn't explain with words, but it made him feel that an injustice was being committed somewhere nearby. His ancestors had taught him that the spirits of the land always manifested when the innocent were in danger, and the growing unease in his chest seemed to confirm this ancient wisdom. His wife, Elena, a kind woman with gentle eyes who had always dreamed of having children, was making breakfast in the simple kitchen. She, too, had noticed her husband's restlessness and approached him on the porch. Placing a hand affectionately on his shoulder, "What is it, my love?" she asked softly, her eyes reflecting concern. "You've seemed restless since you woke up." Joseph held his wife's hand, feeling the comforting warmth of her touch. "I can't explain it, Elena. It's like something is calling for help, but I can't identify what it is or where it's coming from." As the couple talked, Tempest's head shot up, his ears pricked in high alert. The horse had picked up on something the humans couldn't yet perceive. A very faint sound carried on the hot desert wind that made his protective animal heart stir with urgency. It was the weak cry of a child, lost in the vastness, calling for salvation. The horse began to move restlessly, pacing and neighing softly, his behavior clearly altered by something only he could detect at that moment. Tempest's behavior grew more and more agitated as the hours passed. The magnificent white horse could no longer graze peacefully, moving restlessly around the property. His nostrils flared as if trying to catch a specific scent carried on the hot desert wind. His intelligent eyes shone with an urgency Joseph had never seen before in all their years together. Meanwhile, in the heart of the desert, the abandoned baby situation was becoming increasingly critical. The sun had reached its highest point in the sky, and the temperature around the cardboard box surpassed dangerous levels. The child, who had once cried with force, now emitted only weak whimpers, its small voice nearly lost in the oppressive silence of the arid expanse. The cardboard box, which had initially offered some protection, now became part of the problem. The material absorbed the intense heat and retained it, creating a suffocating environment around the child. The edges began to fall apart, and small pieces of cardboard broke off with the wind, scattering across the sand like tragic evidence of the cruel abandonment. But the baby showed an extraordinary resilience that defied all expectations. Despite the impossible conditions, it continued to move, its small fists flailing in the air as if fighting against invisible forces. There was something magical in that determination, a life force that refused to accept defeat, even in the face of the most extreme adversity. It was then that the first real signs of danger appeared on the horizon. A small pack of coyotes, lean and hungry, emerged from behind a distant rock formation. The wild animals, guided by primal instincts and the constant need to find food in the hostile environment, had detected the scent of the helpless child. The coyotes moved with calculated caution, their low, slender bodies gliding across the sand like predatory shadows. Their yellow eyes glinted with a hunger that had been sharpened by days of fruitless searching for prey. The desert was a cruel environment where only the strong survived, and these animals knew an opportunity when they found one. The pack leader, a larger, more experienced coyote, stopped at a safe distance from the box, its nostrils working intensely to confirm what its senses had already detected. The unmistakable scent of a human child, vulnerable and defenseless, made its predatory instincts awaken with a fierce intensity. The other coyotes positioned themselves in a semicircle around the box, keeping a respectful distance as they assessed the situation. They were intelligent creatures, accustomed to hunting in groups and waiting for the right moment to strike. There was no hurry, the prey had nowhere to go, and they could afford to watch and plan. Inside the box, the baby seemed to sense the predator's presence. Its weak whimpers turned back into cries as if some primal instinct was alerting it to the imminent danger. It was as if the child understood, on a subconscious level, that its fight for survival had entered an even more critical phase. The desert wind blew stronger, kicking up small whirlwinds of sand that danced between the coyotes and the box. The sound of the wind mixed with the child's cry created a somber symphony that echoed across the vastness, a lament that seemed to call out to the heavens for divine intervention. The tension in the air was palpable. The coyotes crept a few steps closer, testing the situation, their bodies tense and ready for action. The pack leader let out a low growl, a sound its companions interpreted as a signal that the time to attack was approaching. But something extraordinary was about to happen. Miles away, Tempest raised his majestic head, his ears moving like sensitive antennae, picking up invisible signals. The horse had finally pinpointed the source of his unease, and a fierce determination shone in his intelligent eyes. Nature was about to reveal one of its most impressive miracles. Tempest could no longer contain the urgency building in his chest. The magnificent white horse, driven by an instinct that transcended human understanding, began to gallop in increasingly wider circles around the property. His behavior had become so unusual that both Joseph and Elena came out of the house to watch the animal, concerned by his growing agitation. "I've never seen Tempest like this," Joseph murmured, his experienced eyes studying the horse's every move. "It's like he's trying to tell us something important." Elena held her husband's arm, feeling an unease that mirrored the animal's. "Do you think he's sensed danger? Maybe predators approaching the ranch?" Joseph shook his head slowly. "No, my dear. It's not fear I see in his eyes. It's urgency, as if he needs to go somewhere specific but can't tell us where." Suddenly, Tempest stopped completely, his head held high toward the heart of the desert. His nostrils flared, and he let out a long, loud whinny that echoed across the property like a desperate call. It was a sound the two humans had never heard before, filled with an emotion that seemed almost human. Meanwhile, at the site where the baby had been abandoned, the situation was becoming increasingly perilous. The coyotes had moved even closer to the box, their tensed bodies revealing their intent to attack. The pack leader, an experienced animal scarred by countless battles for survival, took another step toward the defenseless prey. The baby's cry, which had become almost inaudible due to the heat and dehydration, suddenly intensified again. It was as if the child could feel the imminent danger, its most primal instincts warning of the proximity of death. That desperate sound, carried by the hot desert wind, traveled across the vastness like a final plea for salvation. It was at this critical moment that Tempest made a decision that would change the course of the entire story. Without any hesitation, the white horse bolted toward the property gate, leaping over the low fence with a grace that defied his imposing size. Joseph shouted the animal's name, but Tempest was already far away, galloping across the dunes with a speed that seemed supernatural. The horse ran as if his own life depended on it. His powerful hooves struck the scorching sand in a frantic rhythm, kicking up clouds of golden dust that spread through the air like trails of his determination. His muscles worked in perfect harmony, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency as he traversed the rugged terrain. Tempest knew this desert like no other animal. Years of exploration alongside Joseph had etched every trail, every rock, every landmark into his memory. He chose the most direct path, even if it was the most dangerous, leaping over ravines and dodging obstacles with a precision that showcased his superior experience and intelligence. The wind beat against his muzzle as he galloped, carrying with it the increasingly strong scent of the baby and the predators. The distance between them was closing rapidly, but Tempest knew that every second was crucial. His nostrils also picked up the scent of the coyotes, and he could tell there were at least 4 or 5 animals surrounding the child. Back at the ranch, Joseph rushed to grab his saddle and gear, his warrior instincts alerting him to the need to follow his faithful companion. Elena helped him with trembling hands, both understanding that something extraordinary was happening, even without fully grasping the nature of the emergency. "He's never done this before," Elena said, her voice filled with concern. "Tempest has always been obedient. He's never taken off like this without reason." Joseph finished gathering his supplies, including water and a first aid kit. "That's exactly why I know we have to trust him, my dear. Tempest wouldn't act like this without a very important reason. In the desert, the race against time had begun, and the fate of an innocent child depended on the speed and determination of an extraordinary horse who had decided to defy death in the name of life. The distance between Tempest and his destination was shrinking rapidly, but every second felt like an eternity to the horse's racing heart. His hooves hit the scorching sand in a hypnotic rhythm, and his breathing grew heavier as he crossed the steepest dunes. The relentless sun beat down on his white coat, but nothing could diminish his iron will to reach the source of the desperate call that echoed in his soul. At the sight of the abandonment, the tension had reached a critical point. The coyote leader gave the final signal to attack, letting out a low growl that made the other pack members position themselves for the coordinated assault. This was how they hunted, surrounding their prey and attacking simultaneously from different directions. ensuring there was no possibility of escape. The baby, even in its weakened state, seemed to sense the mortal danger. Its weak whimpers turned into a cry that, though faint, carried all the life force still left in its small body. It was a sound that touched something deep in the essence of any living being who heard it, a primal appeal for protection that transcended species and awakened protective instincts in even the most hardened hearts. It was at that very moment that Tempest appeared on the horizon, emerging like a majestic apparition among the golden dunes. The white horse galloped with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics, his silver mane fluttering in the wind like a battle standard. His eyes shone with a fierce determination that made him look more like a guardian spirit than a simple animal. The coyotes noticed the horse's approach immediately. Their sharp senses picked up the sound of hooves on sand long before they could see the animal, and the pack leader raised its head, its pointed ears swiveling like antennae trying to assess the new threat. Instinct told it this was no coincidence. There was something different about this horse, something that commanded a primal respect even in experienced predators. Tempest did not slow down when he spotted the coyotes. On the contrary, he accelerated even more, lowering his head in an attack posture that showed his intention to fight if necessary. His experience in the desert had taught him that some confrontations were unavoidable, and this was definitely one of them. When he reached the site, Tempest immediately positioned himself between the predators and the box containing the baby. He reared up on his hind legs, whinnying loudly with a force that echoed throughout the desert vastness. It was a sound of pure defiance, a clear warning that this child was under his protection and that any attempt to harm it would be met with fierce resistance. The coyotes backed away a few steps, surprised by the unexpected arrival and the horse's intimidating stance. The pack leader growled in response, but there was hesitation in its behavior. Tempest was significantly larger than any of them, and his posture showed no fear or uncertainty. It was clear this would not be an easy fight. For a few tense moments, predator and protector sized each other up in silence. The desert wind blew between them, carrying sand and tension in equal measure. The baby, as if sensing that help had arrived, let out a stronger cry, and that sound seemed to further galvanize Tempest's resolve. The horse began to move in circles around the box, keeping the coyotes always in sight as he marked his protective territory. His movements were calculated and precise, showing that he knew exactly what he was doing. Every step was a declaration that this child was under his care, and he was willing to defend its life with his own. The coyotes, realizing that the element of surprise was lost and that they faced a formidable opponent, began to reconsider their strategy. They were intelligent survivors, accustomed to weighing risks and benefits before every hunt. This confrontation promised to be far more dangerous than they had anticipated, and hunger, no matter how intense, did not justify a fight that could result in serious injury or death. The silent standoff dragged on for several tense minutes, each side carefully weighing their options. Tempest held his defensive position around the box, his muscles tense and ready for action, while the coyotes circled at a respectful distance, occasionally testing the horse's resolve with cautious movements toward the child. The pack leader, an experienced animal that had survived countless dangerous encounters, decided to test the protector's mettle. It took a few steps closer, growling low and baring its teeth in a clear show of threat. It was a common tactic among predators: intimidate the opponent before launching a physical attack. Tempest didn't hesitate to respond. The magnificent white horse reared up again, whinnied with a deafening force, and brought his front hooves down toward the coyote, stopping just inches from its snout. The message was crystal clear: any closer and it would be met with justified violence. His eyes shone with a determination that left no room for doubt about his willingness to fight to the death if necessary. The lead coyote flinched back, clearly impressed by the horse's courage and resolve. It had faced many opponents in its life, but rarely had it encountered one willing to defend something with such ferocity. There was something about this horse that transcended normal animal behavior, a loyalty and bravery that bordered on the supernatural. Meanwhile, the baby inside the box seemed to have found some comfort in the presence of its protector. Its cries became less desperate, though still weak from the heat and dehydration. It was as if the child could sense it was no longer alone, that someone had come to its rescue when all seemed lost. Tempest, noticing the baby's critical condition, made a decision that demonstrated his exceptional intelligence. He positioned himself so that his shadow completely covered the cardboard box, offering the child a desperately needed reprieve from the scorching sun. It was a simple gesture, but one that could mean the difference between life and death in the critical hours to come. The coyotes, frustrated by the horse's persistent presence, began to gradually retreat. They understood that this hunt would require more energy and risk than they were willing to invest. The desert offered other opportunities, and it wasn't worth facing such a determined and powerful opponent for a single prey, no matter how vulnerable it might have seemed. But Tempest knew his victory was only temporary. The predators had not given up completely. They had merely fallen back to reconsider their strategy. They would likely wait until nightfall, when their natural advantages as nocturnal hunters would favor them. The horse understood that he needed to find a more permanent solution to protect the child. While maintaining his protective vigil, Tempest began to assess his options. He couldn't carry the box and the baby alone across the desert to the safety of Joseph's ranch. The child was too fragile, and the journey would be long and perilous. He needed help. But how could he get Joseph to find him in this seemingly infinite vastness? The answer came in the form of an old wisdom he had learned from observing his human companion's habits. Joseph always followed signs and clues when searching for lost animals or tracking threats in the desert. Tempest decided to create his own signs, leaving clear marks in the sand that could guide the tribal elder to this crucial location. With deliberate movements, he began to paw at the sand with his hooves, creating circular patterns around the box. Then he galloped in a straight line for several dozen yards, leaving deep hoofprints that pointed clearly in the direction of the ranch. It was a trail that Joseph would surely recognize and follow, especially given the unusual behavior Tempest had shown before leaving. The sun continued its relentless path across the sky, and Tempest knew that time was quickly running out. The child needed urgent medical care, water, and proper protection from the elements. His shadow offered temporary relief, but it would not be enough to ensure long-term survival. Meanwhile, miles away, Joseph had finally managed to saddle another horse and prepare his supplies for the search. Joseph mounted his second horse, a younger and less experienced animal than Tempest, but still reliable for long desert journeys. Carrying essential supplies and following his keen tracker's instinct, he set off in the direction of the tracks Tempest had left behind. The elder knew that his faithful companion would never act so impulsively without an extremely important reason. As he galloped across the dunes, following the clear trail left by Tempest, Joseph couldn't imagine that miles away, in a luxurious mansion in the nearest city, another drama was unfolding. Richard Sterling, the man who had abandoned the baby in the desert, paced nervously through the marble hallways of his residence, obsessively checking his cell phone. He had returned from his mission in the desert expecting to feel relief, but instead, a growing anxiety gripped his chest. It wasn't remorse. Richard had long ago suppressed any trace of a conscience that might interfere with his goals. It was fear of the consequences, terror that his plan could be discovered, and his carefully constructed reputation would crumble like a house of cards. His late father's will was clear. The billion-dollar inheritance would only be his, as long as Richard maintained an immaculate reputation and a pure bloodline. The old patriarch, obsessed with social appearances and family purity, had structured his will as an elaborate trap. Any scandal, any illegitimate child, any stain on the family's reputation would result in the automatic transfer of the entire fortune to charity. The baby's mother had been a terrible miscalculation. What began as a casual affair had turned into an existential threat when she became pregnant. Richard had tried to convince her to have an abortion, offered her money to disappear, but the young woman had insisted on having the child. Her death during childbirth had solved half the problem, but the baby's existence remained a mortal threat to his plans. That afternoon, as Richard compulsively checked the local news for any mention of a found child, his phone rang. It was his private lawyer, a corrupt and unscrupulous man who had helped cover up several family scandals over the years. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer's tense voice crackled over the phone. "I need to speak with you urgently. There have been complications." Richard's blood ran cold. "And what kind of complications?" "There are rumors in the local Native American community about a child being found in the desert. Nothing confirmed yet. But some of your company's workers are talking about a baby being rescued by one of the tribal elders." Richard felt the world spin. His hand trembled as he held the phone, and a wave of nausea washed over him. "That's impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to the lawyer. "I left. I made sure that—" "Sir," the lawyer's voice brought him back to cruel reality. "Investigate immediately," Richard ordered, his voice regaining some of its calculated coldness. "I want to know everything. Who found it, where it is now, if there's any proof. And most importantly, if anyone suspects anything." "I'm already on it, sir. But I must warn you, if it's true, if the child survived and is being cared for by the tribe, the situation has become much more complicated. We can't just make it disappear again without raising suspicion." Richard began to pace the room, his calculating mind already devising alternative plans. "Then we change the strategy. If we can't eliminate the problem quietly, we'll use the law to our advantage. Prepare a kidnapping charge. Say my son was stolen, that I'm desperate to get him back." "Sir, that's risky. If there's an investigation, they might find out." "They won't find anything," Richard interrupted with a confidence he didn't fully feel. "There are no witnesses to what happened in the desert. It's my word against some tribal members. Who do you think the authorities will believe? A respected businessman or some natives telling fantastic stories about heroic horses?" As this cruel conspiracy unfolded in the city, Joseph finally spotted Tempest on the horizon. What he saw left him completely perplexed. His faithful white horse was standing in the middle of nowhere, clearly protecting something on the sand. As he got closer, Joseph could make out the shape of a cardboard box, and his trained ears picked up a sound that made his heart race, the weak cry of a child. The elder dismounted quickly and ran toward the box, hardly believing his eyes. Inside the heat-damaged cardboard, a newborn baby was bravely fighting for its life. Its skin red from the heat, but its eyes still shining with an extraordinary determination. "Great spirits," Joseph whispered, carefully lifting the child into his arms. Joseph held the baby with the care of one handling the world's most precious treasure. The child was clearly dehydrated and weakened by the extreme heat, but there was something extraordinary in its eyes, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished even in the face of the most adverse circumstances. The elder felt tears stream down his weathered face, moved by both the tragedy of the abandonment and the miracle of survival. "How could anyone do this to such a small child?" he murmured to Tempest, who watched the scene with intelligent eyes that seemed to perfectly understand the gravity of the situation. The horse whinnied softly, as if trying to comfort both the baby and his human owner. Joseph quickly examined the child. Using ancestral first aid knowledge he had learned from his tribe's elders, the baby urgently needed fluids, protection from the heat, and proper medical care, but most importantly, It needed the love and affection it had clearly been denied since birth. With gentle but efficient movements, Joseph wrapped the baby in a blanket he had brought, shielding it from the dry desert wind. He offered the child small sips of lukewarm water, following traditional techniques his wife had taught him years ago, back when they still dreamed of having children of their own. "You're a warrior, little one," Joseph whispered, watching as the baby responded positively to his care. "To survive this, it's a miracle our ancestors would recognize as a sign from the spirits." While tending to the child, Joseph scanned the surroundings for clues as to how the baby had ended up there. His tracking skills, honed over decades, soon identified the prints of expensive shoes in the sand, marks that definitely didn't belong to any local desert dweller. Tempest approached and sniffed the ground where the prints were most visible, clearly agitated by the scent that still lingered. The horse showed an instinctive aversion to the odor, as if he could sense the evil that had been committed in that sacred place. Back at the ranch, Eleanor waited anxiously on the porch, her eyes fixed on the horizon for any sign of her husband's return. When she finally spotted the two figures approaching, Joseph mounted on one horse and Tempest galloping alongside, she immediately knew something extraordinary had happened. It was when she saw what Joseph was carrying carefully in his arms that Elena felt her heart leap. Her maternal instincts, dormant after years of failed attempts to have children, awoke with overwhelming force. She ran to meet her husband, her hands already reaching out to receive the child. "My God, Joseph, where did you find this baby?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion as she gazed at the child's delicate face. "Tempest led me to him," Joseph replied, dismounting carefully so as not to disturb the baby. "He was abandoned in the middle of the desert, inside a cardboard box. If our horse hadn't sensed him and alerted us..." Elena couldn't bear to hear the rest. Tears streamed freely down her face as she took the baby in her arms, feeling an instant, profound connection that sometimes forms between a woman and a child in need. It was as if all her frustrated maternal dreams had finally found a purpose. "He's hungry and thirsty," she observed, noticing the signs of dehydration. "Let's take care of him first, then we'll figure out what to do." In the days that followed, the couple worked tirelessly to restore the baby's health. Elena prepared special formulas using traditional medicinal herbs and hydration techniques she had learned from the elder women of her community. Joseph built a makeshift crib and reinforced the security of the ranch, his protective instincts on high alert due to the mysterious nature of the abandonment. Tempest, for his part, took on the role of the child's official guardian. The horse refused to stray far from the house and maintained a constant vigil. As if he knew that dangers might still threaten the baby he had so determinedly saved. But as the improvised family forged bonds of love and protection, Richard Sterling intensified his efforts to locate and retrieve the child. His private investigators had confirmed that a baby had been found in the area, and he was determined to implement his plan of a kidnapping accusation before the truth about the abandonment could surface. The approaching storm would be far more dangerous than any of the desert's natural phenomena. A week had passed since the rescue, and the baby was showing impressive signs of recovery under the loving care of Joseph and Eleanor. The child had gained weight. Its skin had regained a healthy color, and its eyes shone with a liveliness that deeply touched the couple's hearts. Elena had been completely transformed, as if all her dormant maternal instincts had awakened at once. "He's a miracle," she would whisper every morning as she fed the baby, watching how he responded to her touch with smiles that melted her heart. "Look how he recognizes us, Joseph. It's as if he knows we're here to protect him." Joseph watched his wife with a mixture of admiration and tenderness. He had never seen her so radiant, so complete. The presence of this baby had filled a void in their lives they didn't always admit existed. But, being a practical and experienced man, he also worried about the legal implications of the situation. "We need to think about contacting the authorities, my dear," he said gently one morning, as they watched the baby sleep peacefully in the crib he had built. "Someone must be looking for him. Maybe the parents are desperate." Elena looked at her husband with an expression that mixed fear and determination. "What kind of parents abandon a child in the middle of the desert to die, Joseph? What kind of person does that to a helpless baby?" The question hung between them, heavy with a painful truth they both preferred not to fully confront. They knew, in their hearts, that this abandonment had been deliberate, cruel, and that whoever had done it did not deserve to be called a parent. Meanwhile, in the city, Richard Sterling had dramatically intensified his efforts to locate and retrieve the baby. He had hired private investigators, bribed public officials, and begun to spread a carefully crafted version of events that painted him as a desperate victim. "My son was kidnapped," he told anyone who would listen, his voice filled with the performative emotion he had perfected over years of manipulating business partners. "I was transporting him to a hospital when I was attacked by thugs. They took my car and my baby. I'm offering a substantial reward for any information." The story was elaborate enough to be convincing, yet vague enough to avoid details that could be verified. Richard had carefully chosen the elements of the narrative, preying on existing prejudices against Native American communities and exploiting the natural sympathy people felt for a supposedly desperate father. His lawyer, Dr. Mendoza, had devised an equally manipulative legal strategy. "We'll use the influence and contacts you have in the region," he explained during a meeting in his luxurious office. "The local authorities depend on the taxes and jobs your companies provide. They'll be more inclined to believe your version of events." "And what about the natives?" Richard asked, his voice revealing the calculated coldness behind his emotional facade. "Oh, base, how do we handle them when we find where the child is?" Dr. Mendoza smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "That will be easy. We'll claim they found your son and, instead of turning him over to the authorities as they should have, decided to keep him. Technically, that constitutes kidnapping, regardless of their intentions. But what if they tell their version? If they say they found the baby abandoned, who's going to believe them over you?" Dr. Mendoza replied with sinister confidence. "You are a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. They are, well, they're natives, telling a fantastic story about a heroic horse. People will believe the more plausible version." Richard nodded, satisfied with the strategy. He had underestimated the baby's resilience once. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. This time, he would use the full power of his social standing and wealth to ensure that this threat to his inheritance was eliminated for good. That very afternoon, the first investigators arrived in the region where Joseph and Elena lived. They introduced themselves as people hired by a desperate father, showing photos of the baby that Richard had secretly obtained before the abandonment. The photos were convincing, clearly showing the same child now sleeping peacefully in Elena's arms. The net was closing in on the family that had saved the baby, and they had no idea that a legal storm was about to crash down on their lives. Tempest, ever vigilant, seemed to sense the approaching danger, showing a growing restlessness that made Joseph worry even more about the uncertain future that awaited them. The tranquility of Joseph's ranch was brutally shattered when 3 official vehicles kicked up clouds of dust on the dirt road. Elena, who was nursing the baby on the porch, felt her heart pound as she saw the sheriff's cruisers approaching. Instinctively, she clutched the child to her chest, her maternal instincts screaming of imminent danger. Joseph came out of the house at the sound of the engines, Tempest immediately positioning himself by his side in a clear display of loyalty and protection. The horse seemed to feel the tension in the air, his ears erect and muscles taut, ready to defend his family if necessary. The local sheriff, a middle-aged man clearly uncomfortable with the situation, got out of the first vehicle, flanked by 2 deputies. Behind him, Richard's private investigators emerged, tough-looking men in expensive suits that clashed with the rural setting. "Mr. Joseph Blackwood?" the sheriff asked, consulting a paper in his hand. His voice held a hesitation, as if he wasn't entirely convinced of the mission he was carrying out. "Yes, that's me," Joseph replied with dignity, remaining calm despite the obvious tension. "How can I help you?" "We've received a report of a possible child abduction," the sheriff explained, avoiding direct eye contact. "A businessman from the city claims his newborn son was taken and may be being held here." Elena stood up abruptly, the baby still in her arms, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and outrage. "Abduction? We saved this child. He was abandoned in the desert, nearly dead." One of the private investigators stepped forward, his expression skeptical and hostile. "That's exactly what a guilty person would say. Where's your proof that you found the child instead of just taking him?" Joseph felt anger rise in his chest, but he maintained his composure with the wisdom of someone who had faced prejudice his entire life. "The proof is in the desert, where we found the baby inside a cardboard box, dehydrated and almost dead. My horse led me there." The investigators exchanged mocking glances. "A horse led you there?" one of them repeated with obvious sarcasm. "What a convenient story." It was then that Tempest stepped forward, whinnied loudly, and reared slightly, clearly agitated by the strangers' hostility. His reaction made the investigators back up, but it also reinforced their suspicion that something was being hidden. The sheriff, growing more uneasy, continued his official approach. "I understand this is a delicate situation, but we need to verify the child's identity. Mr. Richard Sterling has provided documentation and photos suggesting this baby is indeed his son." "Documentation?" Elena asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "What kind of father has documents for a son he plans to abandon in the desert to die?" "No one is making accusations yet," the sheriff replied quickly, but his expression revealed that he, too, was beginning to question the story he'd been told. "We just need to clarify the facts." Joseph took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Sheriff, I can show you exactly where we found the child. The tracks are still there, the footprints, the remains of the cardboard box, everything. Evidence that could have been planted." One of the investigators interrupted aggressively. "You've had plenty of time to create any scene you wanted." The tension in the air was palpable. Elena held the baby tighter, tears welling in her eyes as she realized someone was trying to take the child who had become the center of her world. The baby, as if sensing his adoptive mother's anguish, began to cry softly. It was then that Tempest did something that surprised everyone. The horse calmly approached Elena and the baby, positioning himself between them and the hostile investigators. He then lowered his majestic head to the child's level and nuzzled him gently. The baby immediately stopped crying, recognizing the animal who had been his first protector. The sheriff watched this interaction with growing curiosity. "It's true the horse shows an unusual bond with the child," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "That doesn't prove anything," one of the investigators said quickly, clearly annoyed by the display of affection between the animal and the baby. "Horses can be trained to do anything," but there were witnesses. Members of the local community had begun to gather, drawn by the noise of the official vehicles. Neighbors and friends of Joseph arrived one by one, forming a silent circle of support. Among them were respected elders of the tribe, their presence lending moral weight to the situation. One of the elders, a man with white hair and wise eyes, stepped forward. "Sheriff, I've known Joseph since he was a boy. He and Elena are people of honor. If they say they saved this child, then that is what happened." The situation had turned into a confrontation between two completely opposite versions of the truth, and the baby's future depended on who would be more convincing. The tension at the ranch had reached a breaking point when an unexpected discovery completely changed the course of the situation. Maria Sanchez, a young nurse who worked at the city hospital, arrived breathlessly at the property, clutching a folder of documents that trembled in her nervous hands. "Sheriff! Sheriff!" she yelled, running toward the group. "I need to speak with you urgently. It's about this case." Everyone turned to look at the approaching woman, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. The private investigators immediately grew uneasy at her sudden arrival, exchanging worried glances. "Who are you, ma'am?" the sheriff asked, his curiosity clearly piqued. "I'm Maria Sanchez, a nurse at Central Hospital. I assisted in the delivery of this child 2 weeks ago," she said, pointing to the baby in Elena's arms. "And I have to tell you the truth about what really happened." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Tempest seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, standing perfectly still as he watched the scene with his intelligent eyes. Maria took a deep breath before continuing. "This child's mother died during childbirth. She was a young girl, only 17, with no family, who had been abandoned by the baby's father. She told me, before she died, that the man had promised to take care of the child, but she feared he had other intentions." The private investigators tried to interrupt, but the sheriff raised a hand, signaling for Maria to go on. "After the mother died, this man, Mr. Richard Sterling, came to the hospital. He signed all the discharge papers, took the baby, but his behavior was strange, cold, calculating. He showed no affection for the child, no fatherly emotion." "That's speculation," one of the investigators protested. "People grieve differently." Maria looked directly at him, her courage growing. "It wasn't speculation what I saw in the hospital parking lot. I was leaving my shift when I saw Mr. Sterling put the baby in the trunk of his car, not in the back seat with a car seat, like any father would. In the trunk." A murmur of shock went through the assembled crowd. Elena instinctively hugged the baby tighter, her eyes filling with tears as she imagined what this innocent child had endured. "I was so disturbed that I wrote down his license plate," Maria continued, pulling a piece of paper from her folder. "And when I heard the rumors about a baby being found in the desert, I knew I had to come here. This child wasn't kidnapped. He was saved." The sheriff took the paper with the license plate, comparing it to the information he had. His expression gradually shifted from confusion to outrage as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. "There's more," Maria said, her voice gaining strength. "I brought copies of the hospital records. You'll see that this child's mother was not married to Mr. Sterling. She was registered as single, and there were notes from social workers indicating concern about the family situation." As the sheriff examined the documents, one of the tribal elders approached. "And Sheriff, there is something else you should know. Yesterday, some of our young people found this at the spot where Joseph found the baby." The elder held out an expensive, clearly masculine silk handkerchief with gold embroidery. It was half buried in the sand near the remains of the cardboard box. One of the investigators tried to quickly snatch the handkerchief, but the sheriff was faster. Examining the fabric, he found the initials R. C discreetly embroidered in a corner. "Richard Sterling," the sheriff murmured, his voice revealing his growing understanding of the real situation. It was at that moment that Tempest behaved in a way that stunned everyone present. The horse approached the private investigators and began to show agitation, whinnying loudly and rearing up whenever they tried to get near the baby. It was as if the animal recognized the scent of these men and associated it with danger. "Interesting," the sheriff observed. "The horse seems to have a very specific reaction to you, gentlemen." The investigators were visibly nervous now, realizing their mission had gone terribly wrong. The truth was emerging in a way they could not control or manipulate. Maria delivered the final blow by opening another folder of documents. "I also brought this. Copies of financial records showing that Mr. Sterling tried to bribe hospital staff to alter birth certificates and death records. He wanted to erase any evidence that this child ever existed." The sheriff looked around, observing the honest faces of the community members, the protective behavior of the horse, the convincing documents from the nurse, and finally understood the magnitude of the injustice he had nearly committed. "Gentlemen," he said with renewed authority, "and I believe we need to have a very serious conversation with Mr. Richard Sterling about his true intentions regarding this child." The final confrontation took place at the city's police station, where Richard Sterling had been summoned to clarify some inconsistencies in his version of the facts. He arrived accompanied by his lawyer, Dr. Mendoza, and a team of advisors, all impeccably dressed and radiating the typical arrogance of those who believe money and influence can buy any kind of justice. Richard maintained his facade of a desperate father, but his hands trembled slightly as he signed the attendance forms. His cold eyes showed the calculating frigidity that had led him to abandon a helpless child in the desert. But now they also revealed the fear of seeing his carefully laid plans unravel. Across the table, the sheriff had gathered all the evidence: Maria Sanchez's testimony, the hospital records, the handkerchief with his initials found at the scene of the abandonment, and the consistent statements from the tribal community about Tempest's heroic rescue. Each piece of the puzzle painted a devastating picture of Richard's premeditated cruelty. "Mr. Sterling," the sheriff began, his voice carrying an authority he hadn't shown before, "there are some serious discrepancies in your version of events. I'd like you to explain how your personal handkerchief ended up at the exact spot where the baby was found abandoned." Dr. Mendoza immediately tried to intervene. "My client does not have to answer speculative questions based on circumstantial evidence." "Circumstantial," the sheriff retorted, placing photos of the abandonment site, copies of hospital records, and the silk handkerchief on the table. "Would we have physical evidence, testimony from respected healthcare professionals, and a pattern of behavior that suggests premeditation?" Richard felt sweat trickle down his back despite the room's air conditioning. His calculating mind worked feverishly to find a way out, but for the first time in his life, he was facing consequences his money couldn't buy. It was at that moment that the door to the room opened and Joseph entered, accompanied by Eleanor, who was carrying the baby in her arms. The sheriff had requested their presence as part of the fact-finding process. When Richard saw the child, healthy, well cared for, clearly loved, something in his expression shifted. For the first time, he was face to face with the life he had tried to destroy. And the contrast between the child thriving in Elena's arms and the memory of the cardboard box in the scorching desert hit him like a punch to the gut. "This is the child you claim was kidnapped," the sheriff said, watching Richard's reaction closely. "Notice how happy and healthy he looks in the arms of the family that saved him." Elena approached the table, her gaze fixed on Richard with a mixture of compassion and reproach that was more powerful than any verbal accusation. "How could you do this?" she asked softly. "Ray, how could you abandon such a small child to die alone in the desert heat?" Richard tried to maintain his composure, but something in Elena's genuinely maternal voice shattered his carefully constructed defenses. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice losing some of its usual arrogance. "You don't know what was at stake." "What was at stake?" Joseph asked, his voice calm but firm. "Are more important than the life of an innocent child." "My inheritance!" Richard exploded, finally losing control. "Billions of dollars, generations of my family's work." The will was clear. Any illegitimate child meant losing everything. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Mendoza closed his eyes, realizing his client had just publicly confessed his motive for the crime. The advisors exchanged panicked glances, understanding they were witnessing the end of Richard's political and business career. "So, you admit you deliberately abandoned your own son in the desert?" the sheriff asked, his voice filled with disbelief and revulsion. Richard looked around the room, seeing the expressions of shock and condemnation on every face. For the first time in his life, he realized the monstrosity of his actions. Seeing the baby smiling innocently in Elena's arms, he understood that he had tried to destroy something pure and precious for the sake of a wealth that at that moment seemed utterly meaningless. He began, his voice failing. I thought it would be quick. I thought he wouldn't suffer much. The final confession sealed his fate. The sheriff activated the official recorder and formalized the confession, while Dr. Mendoza desperately tried to convince his client to stop talking. But Richard continued, as if a dam had broken in his soul. When I left him there, he was crying so much, but I thought about the inheritance, the family empire, everything I would lose. I told myself it was necessary. Elena held the baby tighter, tears streaming down her face as she imagined the terror and abandonment the innocent child had experienced. Joseph placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder, his eyes fixed on Richard with a mixture of pity and outrage. But he survived, Richard continued, looking at the baby with an expression that mixed remorse and something that might have been relief. Against all odds, he survived. The months following Richard's confession brought a complete transformation to the lives of everyone involved in the tragedy that had almost unfolded in the desert. The legal process was swift and final. Richard Sterling was convicted of child endangerment, attempted murder, and a series of other crimes related to his attempts to cover up the truth. His sentence would see him spend many years reflecting on the choices he had made. The billion-dollar inheritance he had tried so hard to protect ended up exactly where it was meant to be. With the baby he had tried to eliminate, a wise judge determined that the child, now officially named Gabriel by his adoptive parents, would be the sole legal heir to the Sterling Empire. The irony of the situation was lost on no one. Richard had destroyed his own life, trying to prevent something that inevitably came to pass. Joseph and Elena, after a careful but compassionate legal process, were officially recognized as Gabriel's adoptive parents. The judge, impressed by the evident love they showed for the child and the heroic circumstances of the rescue, issued the final adoption papers without hesitation. The family that had been born from a tragedy was now officially united under the law. He was always our son, Elena said on the day they received the final papers, tears of happiness streaming down her face as she held Gabriel, now a healthy, smiling baby. From the moment Tempest brought him into our lives, the white horse, who had been the true hero of the entire story, seemed to understand the importance of the moment. He always stayed close whenever Gabriel was in the yard, like an eternal guardian who would never forget his role in saving that precious life. The bond between the animal and the child had become legendary in the region, inspiring stories that would be told for generations. Maria Sanchez, the courageous nurse who had risked her own safety to reveal the truth, was publicly recognized for her bravery. The hospital where she worked promoted her to a supervisory position, and she became an active advocate for the rights of vulnerable children. Her courage had been instrumental in ensuring that justice prevailed. The local tribal community was also recognized for its role in protecting Gabriel. Human rights organizations highlighted how their ancestral traditions of protecting the innocent had been crucial in saving a life. The case became a powerful example of how traditional wisdom and community values could triumph over corruption and greed. Dr. Mendoza, the corrupt lawyer who had aided Richard in his schemes, lost his law license and faced his own legal consequences. The private investigators who had tried to intimidate Joseph and Elena were prosecuted for coercion and conspiracy. Justice, though sometimes slow, had finally caught up with all those responsible. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred within Richard himself. During his first months in prison, he went through a profound crisis that forced him to confront the monstrosity of his actions. Specialized therapists worked with him to understand how his obsession with wealth and status had completely corrupted his basic human values. In a letter he wrote to Joseph and Elena months after his conviction, Richard finally showed a genuine remorse that had been absent his entire adult life. "I know I can never forgive myself for what I tried to do," he wrote in a shaky hand. "Dear, but knowing that Gabriel is growing up surrounded by love gives me a small measure of peace. You have given him what I never could, a real family." The letter continued with a formal renunciation of all parental rights and a request that Gabriel never learn his true biological identity until he was an adult and could understand the complexity of the situation. It was perhaps the first truly selfless act of his entire life. Gabriel grew quickly, showing the same extraordinary resilience he had displayed in the desert. He was a cheerful, intelligent, and loving child who adored playing near Tempest and seemed to have a special connection with all the animals on the ranch. Elena often remarked that he seemed to instinctively understand the importance of protecting the weak and vulnerable. Joseph's ranch had become an informal pilgrimage site for people who heard the story of the heroic rescue. Families came from far and wide to see the horse that had saved a life and to meet the family that had turned a tragedy into a miracle of love. Joseph and Elena welcomed everyone with hospitality, always willing to share their story and the message of hope it represented. "What I've learned from all this," Joseph reflected in an interview with a local newspaper, "is that true miracles happen when we choose love over fear, compassion over greed." 6 months had passed since that terrible day in the desert, and life at Joseph's ranch had found a new, joyous rhythm. Gabriel, now a robust and smiling baby of nearly 8 months, crawled around the yard under the watchful eye of Tempest, who had taken on the role of eternal guardian with a dedication that touched the hearts of all who witnessed their extraordinary friendship. It was a golden autumn morning when Elena watched from the porch as Gabriel tried to reach for Tempest's mane, who patiently lowered his head to allow the child's small hands to explore his silky coat. The white horse made soft sounds, almost like lullabies, whenever Gabriel got close. It was a scene that repeated daily, but it never lost its power to deeply move her. "Look at those two," Joseph said affectionately, joining his wife on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. "It's like they're connected by something beyond human understanding." Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with the pure happiness of a woman who had found her purpose in life. "Gabriel will grow up knowing he was saved by love, Joseph. That will make all the difference in the person he becomes." The transformation of their lives had been complete and profound. Gabriel's inheritance was being managed by a trust fund that would secure his education and future, but also allocated large sums to organizations that protected vulnerable children and preserved Native American traditions. It was a form of poetic justice. The money that almost cost Gabriel his life would now serve to protect other children in similar situations. Tempest raised his head as a vehicle approached on the dusty road. It was Maria Sanchez, who had become a regular visitor and a dear friend of the family. She came at least once a week to check on Gabriel's development and to simply enjoy the peace that emanated from this place where a miracle had occurred. "How's our little warrior today?" Maria asked cheerfully, getting out of her car and heading straight for Gabriel, who crawled toward her with a radiant smile. "Stronger every day," Elena replied, picking up her son. Yesterday he stood up on his own for the first time, holding onto Tempest's saddle. Maria watched the interaction between Gabriel and Tempest with renewed admiration. As a healthcare professional, she had witnessed many cases of impressive recovery, but never anything that compared to the resilience and vitality this child showed. It was as if the pure love he received daily had healed not only the physical traumas of abandonment, but had also strengthened his soul in a way that transcended traditional medicine. "I heard news about Richard," Maria said softly after Gabriel had gone back to playing in the yard. "The prison psychologists say he's undergoing a genuine transformation. He started volunteering in the inmate literacy program." Joseph nodded thoughtfully. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even after the most terrible mistakes. I hope he finds peace with himself. It's amazing how you can maintain such compassion, Maria observed. After everything he did, anger would only poison our hearts, Elena explained, watching Gabriel, who was now playing with small twigs on the ground, always under Tempest's protective gaze. Gabriel deserves to grow up in a home free of bitterness. He deserves to know only love. The sun began to set, painting the desert sky with golden and pink hues that turned the entire landscape into a work of natural art. Gabriel, tired from playing, approached Tempest and lay down against the horse's soft flank, who immediately adjusted his position to serve as a living pillow for the child. Joseph watched the scene with tears in his eyes. "Remember when I said I felt something calling for help that day? I realize now it wasn't just Gabriel. It was our own need to form a family, to have a greater purpose. The spirits of the ancestors knew," a wise voice said from behind them. It was the tribal elder who had arrived silently, as was his custom. They connected 3 souls who needed each other, the 2 of you who needed a son to love, Gabriel, who needed parents to protect him, and Tempest, who needed to show that love transcends species. As night fell, the family gathered on the porch to share their evening meal. Gabriel slept peacefully in Elena's lap, while Tempest grazed nearby, his ears always alert for any sound that might signal a need for protection. The stars began to appear in the vast desert sky, each one seeming like a celestial blessing upon this family that had been born from tragedy and had blossomed in love. The same sky that had once witnessed cruelty and abandonment now watched over hope and redemption. "He will know this story when he's older," Elena murmured, adjusting Gabriel in her arms. "He will know he was saved not just by us, but by a heroic horse and an entire community that chose good." Joseph looked toward the horizon where the golden dunes met the starry sky, and he will grow up knowing that even in the most arid and hostile places, love can flourish when brave hearts decide to act. Tempest whinnied softly in the distance, as if agreeing with the wise words. The horse, who had defied predators and the elements to save a life, would remain the silent guardian of this family, a living reminder that true miracles happen when love overcomes fear. And so, under the starry blanket of the desert that was once nearly the scene of a tragedy, a new story of hope continued to be written each day, proving that kindness, courage, and unconditional love will always triumph over cruelty and greed.